Chapter 11. As the horses started up, Dorothy refuted Tom's statement indignantly. "It isn't a blind alley. It's a good clue. We've run down practically every other line, and now we may as well try this. Everything points to the belief that the man is a scientist of no slight ability. Whether he or someone else discovered his high-power radioactive force, he must be a good man, or he wouldn't be able to use it. Now it seems probable to me that he was working with phosphorescent ink simply because it was the nearest at hand. A man engaged in research like that would be likely to have at least one assistant. I propose to find that assistant." "I'd like to see you do it," said Tom doubtingly. "How would you go to work?" "I'd advertise," said Dorothy. "Advertise," remarked Tom. "Here's the way to do it. Wanted, the assistant of the man who is trying to stop all war." "Of course not, stupid," said Dorothy impatiently. "We'll advertise for a man who has some experience in making phosphorescent ink. That's the line to work on. Don't you see that since phosphorescent paint acts best with such energy as is given by radioactive substances, that he's likely to have been using it? There's such a close relation between phosphorescence and radioactivity that a man might be working with both." "But where will you advertise?" I said. "How can you tell where the man has worked? How can you tell his nationality? I think he's an American, but no one can tell." "If you mean Dick Regnier," exclaimed Dorothy, her eyes flashing, "you're wrong. I've known him for years, and I know he is not the man. It takes just a touch of insanity that Dick never had to do what the man is doing. The man must be practically a monomaniac on the subject." The bus stopped just as the bank came in sight. Dorothy turned squarely in her seat and faced me. The seats around us happened to be empty. She looked at my somewhat guilty face and spoke emphatically. "Jim Orrington, you don't believe me, but it isn't Dick Regnier." "Now, Dorothy," I said, "look here. How did that letter get changed, unless it was done by Regnier that night at your cousin's?" "I don't know," she answered. "Oh, come now," said Tom. "Drop it. Here's where we get off." We had drawn our money and started away, when I suddenly thought of the mail. I turned back to the little window and asked if there were any letters for us which had not been forwarded. A few moments brought a big package, among them 3 or 4 bulky envelopes from the office. Hailing a cab, we read busily as we drove back to the Savoy. One long typewritten report I read with especial care, and handed over to Dorothy when she had finished her mail. She looked at me reproachfully as she read the title. "And you never mentioned this at all?" "I forgot all about it," I answered. "I started that inquiry the day I was in prison. The night I got out, the Denkel letter came, and we've been so busy ever since that I completely forgot this." "Let's hear it," said Tom. "Just read the condensed paragraph at the top. That tells the whole story. You can read the rest at your leisure." Dorothy began in her clear voice. "Report on Mr. Richard Regnier. Richard Regnier is the son of the late Colonel Arthur Regnier of Savannah, Georgia. He was educated at private schools and at Princeton. His residence is Savannah, but he has spent much time in England. He specialized in chemistry when in college, and published one paper after graduation on some rare chemical compounds. He has no regular occupation, has an independent income, and spends most of his time in various philanthropic works. Is a member of several organizations, such as the Peace Society, the Tuberculosis League, etc., and of 4 clubs. Complete details given below. Every effort has been made to obtain his present address, but not even his bankers know it. The only fact concerning this which could be obtained was that he sailed for Europe on the Hamburg American line the last of June this present year. For details of this part of the investigation, see below." "Well, he didn't do it. He isn't doing it," said Dorothy emphatically. "He's got the training for it," said Tom reflectively. "I am sure," began Dorothy, but I broke in. "What's the use of discussing it now? We can't get a hold of Regnier anyway, and your phosphorescent ink scheme seems the next scheme to try. Here we are at the Temple. Let's go to one of my friends who is a solicitor here, and see if we can use his office as headquarters to see the applicants." So the discussion ended. A brief interview with my friend, and a short debate on the best method of procedure, brought us to certain conclusions. It was really just as possible that the man had worked in London as anywhere else, and we decided to advertise in 6 of the morning papers for 3 days, asking for a man who had had some experience with phosphorescent inks, and who was capable of assisting in a scientific examination with regard to them. Applicants were to meet at the office of my friend in the Middle Temple at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 3rd day. For 2 days and a half I spent my time watching the preparations for war, and urging forward the search for Regnier. He had completely dropped out of sight. No information of his whereabouts could be obtained, and when we met at the temple on the afternoon of the 3rd day, we were no further ahead. At 3 o'clock the waiting room of the office was full, and a long line of men extended down the stairs. The crowd bore striking witness to the horde of unemployed seeking for even the slightest chance of employment. My friend's clerks were in despair, but somehow they managed to evolve something like order from the mass, and one by one the applicants were admitted. After the first half-dozen, we saw that they could be divided into 3 classes: the men who knew nothing about science and nothing about any kind of ink, the men who knew something about ink but nothing about phosphorescent ink, and the men who had been laboratory assistants to various research followers. We divided them rapidly on this basis, and in an hour had dismissed all the members of classes 1 and 2. There were left some 10 others who had been assistants in research laboratories. One by one we examined these. They had worked in various lines, the first 5 in chemical researches, the last 5 in various physical and engineering lines. Try as we might, we could get no information from any of them with regard to phosphorescent ink, or with regard to any unusual work with radioactive energy. The last man had been dismissed, and we had sat down to afternoon tea with my friend, when we heard words in the outer office. The door opened, and a clerk entered. "There's one more man, sir," he said. "I told him he was too late, but he's quite insistent, sir. Will you care to see him?" "Surely," I said, and we all went out into the outer office. A tall, bent man with drooping mustache stood by the window. His gaunt face and threadbare clothes, neatly brushed though they were, showed an evident lack of prosperity. "I ventured to insist, sir," he said, addressing me, "as I have had quite a little experience in phosphorescent ink. It was only a year ago that I served in a laboratory where they were working with it, and while I was simply working under the direction of other people, I think I could work well along that line. I should try to do my best. I need a place." This looked more like the real thing. I waved towards Tom. He could run this end of the inquiry better than I. "What's your name?" "George Swinton." "Where did you have your experience?" questioned Tom. "With Dr. Heidenmuller in his private research laboratory," answered the man. "What training have you had?" "Not much. Only a few courses at the University of London. I was only the 2nd assistant. I worked with Dr. Heidenmuller for 4 years, until he died 6 months ago. I have had no place since, sir." "Did your employer do anything with radioactive work?" "Yes, sir. He died that way. He was killed, paralyzed, you might say, while working with something in a locked room. He always did that work in a locked room." "What were the circumstances of his death?" asked Tom. The man hesitated and looked up somewhat fearfully. "I don't see what that has to do with phosphorescent ink," he said. "The police went all into the matter of his death, and they said it was just death by paralysis." He stopped and shut his mouth hard. Dorothy broke in. "Mr. Swinton, here is the state of affairs. I don't think my brother has made it quite plain. We are more interested in Dr. Heidenmuller's radioactive work than in his phosphorescent paint. We have no question of you at all. We do not want to know anything which is not entirely right for us to know, but we do want to know all you feel you can rightly tell us of his work. I feel sure that my brother will be ready to employ you if you can show that you have done this, and that you can do what he wants." The man's face cleared. Dorothy's words were more convincing than evidence. He reached into his pockets and drew forth a bunch of papers, which he gave to Tom, who rapidly ran through them. "They're all right," he said, handing them back. "Now, if I give you £20 a month for 2 months, will that be all right?" A dull red rose in the man's face as his eyes lighted. "It will mean everything to me, sir," he said. "I've got a wife and a boy." Tom drew out his purse. Here's £10 to clinch the bargain," and he handed him 2 5-pound notes. "I appreciate that more than I can say," said the man, the tears welling up in his eyes with emotion. "Now, what did you want to know?" "First, about Dr. Heidenmuller's apparatus, and then about his death." "I'm afraid I can't tell you much of the apparatus. I never even saw it. It was in an inner room to which the doctor had the only key. I never was in the room till the day we broke down the door and took him out dead. There was no apparatus there then. It must have been removed." "How did the room look?" asked Dorothy. "It was all bare. Nothing in it at all, except a wooden chair where he sat, and a wooden table." "How about the walls and ceiling?"
"They were all of wood."
"How about the locks on the door and the windows?"
"That was a funny thing. They were of wood too, though he had an iron key."
"What did the doctor have in his pockets?"
4 5-pound notes, no change, and his watch was gone."
"There was nothing in his watch pocket except a watch crystal.
His keys were gone too, and only the ribbon of his watch was left lying on the floor."
"What did the doctor say about his death?"
"Straight paralysis, they said. I had been away for 3 days. He was around the laboratory for 1 day after I left, and the day after that he must have died. They said death was instantaneous."
"Did the doctor leave any family?"
"None."
"What became of his papers?"
"Nobody knows. He had scarcely any friends. His property went to a niece in Germany, and she came over to hunt for papers, but she found none."
"What became of the other assistant?"
"He went back to Germany. He knew nothing more than I did, however."
"Did the doctor have any friends who came to see him?"
"Very few. There was one American who came to see him now and then. I never knew his name or where he came from, nor did I know the name of the 2 or 3 German friends he had."
"Anything else you can think of?"
asked Tom. "Nothing else, I'm afraid," answered Swinton. Tom rose from his chair and paced up and down the room, his hands in his trouser pockets, his coat flung back. As he walked, Swinton, watching him, uttered an exclamation. "I can tell you one thing about the American," he said. "He wore a peculiar shaped pin on his waistcoat, such as you wear on your fob." Tom pulled up his fob with its Theta Sigma Rho pin. "There's a good clue anyway," he said. "He must be a Theta Sigma Rho man." We could get nothing more from Swinton, and after directing him to call at the Savoy the next morning, we sent him away happy. As we came down the narrow stairs and out of the old arched passages of the temple, Dorothy said, "Let's walk up the embankment to the hotel. We can think better that way." We had gone half the distance when she stopped. "Suppose we talk it over here," and we stopped beside the parapet to discuss the matter.
"As I make it out,"
said Tom, "Heidenmuller was the man who discovered the secret power which has been destroying the battleships, but he can't be the man because he died before the first ship went down. Therefore he must have passed it on to someone else who was using it, possibly the American who was his friend, or one of the Germans. It strikes me that the next thing to do is to find an American in London who wears a Theta Sigma Rho pin." Instantly I startled the peaceful calm of the embankment and made myself an object of suspicion to the neighbouring bobby by leaping up in the air and clapping my hands together. "Hammerly, by all that's holy!" I cried. "You remember that fellow I took home that night you arrived, Dorothy?" She nodded, her eyes gleaming with interest. "He's one of our men. He had an acid stain on his coat. I'll wager you he's the American. I know where he lives, and I've been up to see him once, but he was out. I'll go up there right after dinner."
"Do you think he's the man?"
asked Tom in excitement. "I don't see how he could be," I said slowly. "The man was working in the Channel when he was in the British Museum, but he's surely the next man to interview." By 8 I was in a hansom, speeding towards Half Moon Street. "Was Mr. Hammerly in?" He was, and met me halfway down the stairs. "Oh, this is very good of you, Orrington," he said. "I was very sorry to miss your last call." For some time we talked of various things, of college days and of affairs at home. He had come over as a Rhodes Scholar,
having little money left him while at Oxford, had gone on in London after graduation, leading a life of quiet study. As we talked, I sized my companion up. A trifle grave, but after all a sane, sterling fellow, I decided, and I put my errand directly to him. "You knew Dr. Heidenmuller?" I said abruptly. "Yes, poor old chap," he said calmly. "How did you happen to run across him?" "I didn't know him personally," I said, "but I knew a man who did know him. One of our own men, Tom Haldane of Columbia, who is very greatly interested in the radioactive work which Dr. Heidenmuller was carrying on before his death, is here with me." Hammerly's face filled with eagerness. His whole attitude changed. "Did Haldane know what he was doing?" he asked breathlessly. "Not exactly," I said. "Well, if he knows anything about it, I believe he knows one of the greatest things in modern science. The doctor never told me anything about it, but I went into that room the day he was taken out dead, and ever since that time I felt that he had found a force greater than anything he had obtained, and that force killed him." He paused. "I've never said anything to anybody else, but Haldane is the man of all others to know it, and you might tell him that from me. He may be able to use it somehow. I can't. I tried my best to get hold of some clue concerning it after Heidenmuller's death, but it was absolutely useless. Do you think that Haldane has enough data to work it out?" "Frankly, I don't know," I said. "Except for two things, I should have said the secret died with him," said Hammerly slowly. I bent forward, hanging on every word. "I've never spoken of either, but—" he paused. "You know this man who is trying to stop all war?" I nodded. "Well, from the way Heidenmuller's room looked and the way the things in his pockets were left, I've wondered if the man had not his secrets. Do you know," he said, leaning forward, "there were no eyelets in his shoes when he was found. The crimps were in the leather of the strings, but the metal ends were gone. The lenses of his spectacles, without any mounting, were lying on the floor. The very filling of his teeth had gone. Why couldn't a battleship disappear into its elemental parts the same way, all its living contents paralyzed by the shock, dying instantly and sinking below the waves? I've wondered more than once if the government sent down divers in Portsmouth Harbor, and if they did, what they found." There was just one thing to do. He held as much as we did of the secret. Perhaps he knew more. From beginning to end, I told the whole story of our search. As I went on, he grew more and more excited. As I paused toward the end, he broke in. "The second thing fits in here, the reason why I believe the secret might not be lost. One day, as I went into the laboratory, the doctor's assistant told me that he was in the inner room, but had left word for me to wait. I was extremely curious, for no one had ever entered that inner room to my knowledge. The door opened at last, and a tall, dark man, an American, I should say, came out of that closed room with the doctor. I never saw him before or since. Now, is he the man who got the secret? And with it, is he trying to stop all war?" I was out of my seat with excitement. "I believe he is. Would you know him if you saw his photograph?" "Surely," said Hammerly. I rose to go. "Hold on," exclaimed Hammerly. "I haven't told you half yet." "Go on," I said eagerly, seating myself once more. "That first day, after I had made a rough examination, I started to go over the inner room inch by inch. At first I thought it was perfectly insulated by wood. There wasn't a piece of metal, nor even a piece of glass in it. Where the incandescent light came down, hung a bit of twisted cord, without a scrap of metal remaining. There was a length of insulating cloth, minus the wire it covered, lying on the floor. I went round and round hunting for metal, but I could find none. There was a wooden shutter over the window and no glass. I closed the door and walked over every inch of the room, trying to find any break whatsoever in the insulation. The only thing I could find was a faint glimmer where the wooden window shutter did not quite join. I went outside and studied the place from the street. There was no appearance of anything unusual on the wall of the laboratory, excepting that the boarded window of the wooden room looked out like a rectangular unseen eye. I crossed to the sidewalk just before the laboratory and looked up and down the opposite wall. There was nothing unusual on that side, save two square places side by side on the painted wall, which looked fresher than the wall around. I examined them more carefully, crossed and recrossed. The two spots were almost exactly opposite the lower end of the shuttered window, where I had seen a slight chink of light, the only place where the insulation of wood was broken. I went up the stairs of the house opposite. It was a little tea shop. A wooden sign leaned against the wall beside the door. I picked it up. The screw holes and the white of paint where the hinges had lain showed clear, but there was no metal about it. The proprietress bustled up to take my order, and as she saw me looking at the sign, broke into voluble explanation. I should have put the sign back in its place, sir, but fairly didn't dare to. It was a week come Tuesday when it fell. It's God's own mercy there wasn't somebody killed, sir. And the strangest thing, too, I couldn't find sight nor smell of the hinges and the rod where it hung. It must have pulled out of the wall, and somebody have picked up the iron before I could get down, sir. Now, isn't that strange, sir? It had fallen the day that Heidenmuller died. I went back into the laboratory and hunted over every square inch of it, but I found nothing. I stood there puzzling. If there had been some power that had killed Heidenmuller, there must have been some material substance in which it was kept. I had made the most careful inquiries about the things on his person and in the room. No one could tell me anything. Swenton and Gregan, the two assistants, were neither of them there, but the first one who entered the room when the doctor's body was found was a sharp-faced lad who acted as janitor. I had questioned him thoroughly, as I thought, but I resolved to see if he did not know more. I went to him again, and a lucky inspiration came to me. Holding a sovereign in my hand, I remarked casually, "If there is any little personal memento of the doctor left, I should like very much to have it." The narrow eyes of the lad gleamed. He thrust his hand into his pocket and drew out what was apparently a leather cigarette case, snatched the sovereign, and handed me the case. "Found it on the floor after he took him out," he mumbled. "It's the only thing was there." Hammerly rose as he spoke and walked to his desk. I followed, my heart pulsating with great leaps. He took from a drawer what seemed to be a pigskin cigarette case, cut in half. Hammerly held the two sections out in his hand. At the top was a queerly constructed valve. The case was lined with a black substance that looked like rubber. "I believe," said Hammerly gravely, "that in this case there was some terrifically powerful substance which killed Heidenmuller and destroyed all the metal in the wooden room by escaping through the accidentally opened valve. I believe the man who is trying to stop all war uses the same dread agent. I believe, once the substance escapes and does its work, that it turns into a harmless gas, as hydrogen, once it has been exploded with oxygen, forms harmless water, or as the carbon of coal, which has blazed when united with the oxygen of the air, becomes, after that union, inert carbon dioxide. You know now all I know. I've done all I could with it," he ended. "Take it to Haldane." Dazed with the story, I could only thank him and take the case. We parted with a word of goodwill and assurance of secrecy on his side. Chapter 12. I threw up my curtain next morning to find London settling down into a sea of fog. Already the Thames was wholly hidden, and the water side of the embankment showed only faint twinkling lights, just on the point of complete extinguishment. The caped policeman, the hurrying butcher's boy, the labourers, and the charwomen passing through the garden below, had all completely lost their individuality, and became, in place of common London types, misty 20th century Niobes. But dismal though it was without, my spirits were cheerful enough within as I started down to meet Tom and Dorothy. We were half through breakfast when Hammerly's card was brought in, to be followed a few moments later by the man himself. I looked with delighted interest at the involuntary start that he gave when he met Dorothy. How I wish I might rightly describe her as she stood there, lighting by her very presence the grey interior of the dining room, shrouded as it was by the London particular. Everything else was gloom, save in the circle where Dorothy gave the radiance of her presence. Hammerly's silent tribute was no more than she exacted from all who met her. Again and again I marvelled at my audacity in believing I might have this incarnation of youth, of power, and beauty for my own. Such thoughts raced through my head as I sat watching the swift interchange of question and answer between Tom, Dorothy, and Hammerly. In response to their inquiries, Hammerly related the story he had told me the day before, and as he ended asked, "What are you going to do next? How are you planning to use your man Swenton?" Dorothy answered for Tom and myself. "We are going straight to Dr. Heidenmuller's laboratory, taking Swenton along. I want to have the whole scene before my eyes to see what can be made out of it. We should be very glad to have you come with us, Mr. Hammerly." Tom bent towards me with a look of mock anguish on his brow. "How I had hoped for a peaceful Sunday morning," he said in a low aside. "And now we've got to plunge out into a nasty fog, chase all over this benighted city. Never mind, I might have known. I never can have my own way." Despite his plaint, Tom was the first one ready, as, clothed in raincoat and slouch hat, our little party gathered under the shelter of the glass awning inside the court. The massive dignity of the carriage porter, shrouded in a white glistening rubber coat, loomed bulkier than ever, as with an elephantine grace he whistled shrilly twice. Out of a dim background, two hansoms dashed into the circle of light, where the arcs of the entrance fought bravely against the encroaching fog. "I'm going with Mr. Hammerly," said Tom. "You take Dorothy and the other hansom, Jim, and drive straight. We'll pick up Swenton on the way. Give the address, will you, Hammerly?" "Old Jewelry, 3rd Alley, this side of Gresham Street," said Hammerly, and the cabbies nodded. Dorothy stepped lightly in before I could lend my aid. I followed. The porter closed the curtaining doors, pulled up the window, and we were off, embarked on a sea of fog. As I looked out, I thought I saw Tom speaking to our driver, but I could not be sure. "Old Jewelry," said Dorothy dreamily. "How delightfully Dickinsonian. I haven't an idea where it can be, and I don't want to know. It's much more fun plunging off into an unknown world of adventure in the good ship hansom cab." I happened to have a strong idea where Old Jewelry was, but some guardian angel kept me from speaking. Never before had I possessed all that was precious to me in life in the small capacity of a hansom cab. Outside passed slowly by a dim neutral city, into which street lamps cast pointed lines of light in a vain endeavour to pierce the gloom, where ghosts, appearing suddenly under our horses' feet, disappeared quite as suddenly into the blanketing darkness, and where now and then a motor bus came looming past us like some high-pooped caravel of Spain. Now and again we stopped. Now and again we crept at a foot pace through what seemed at one and the same time an eternity of joy and a fleeting moment of happiness. Dorothy lay back against the cushioned corner, taking in the experience to the utmost. We spoke but seldom. I proffered no suggestions. It was enough for me to sit beside her, to know the rough cloth of her tweed ulster touched my hand, to feel through every inmost fibre of my being her dear and sweet proximity. On and on we travelled, till at length I came to the sudden realization that, according to all my impressions, we should have been at our destination long before. I looked out carefully for the first time. The fog was as dense as ever. I knew nothing of my whereabouts. Saying no word to Dorothy, I kept on trying to pierce the wall of cloud, as 100 questions began to spring up in my brain. Was there something queer in this? Was the driver lost? Or was he purposely taking us in some dangerous direction? It did not matter anyway. As I looked at Dorothy, I knew I could protect her against 1,000 perils, and I felt a warm glow of power, of courage springing within my soul. Just then I saw some arc lights ahead, and I peered yet more carefully. Under them the fog seemed less dense, and when a brass plate showed I scanned it eagerly. Charterhouse. I could read no more, but that told me where I was, in Charterhouse Square, beyond Smithfield, almost to Clerkenwell Road. We had gone far out of our way, while I had been dreaming. I threw up the driver's door. "You must be out of your way," I cried. "I couldn't do better, sir," came the answer. "I had to come round, and I made it straight for Old Jewelry, sir." Perhaps there was a note of laughter in the man's voice. Certainly there was nothing sinister. I recalled the glimpse I had caught of Tom beside the cab at the Savoy, and, my qualms ceasing, I inwardly blessed that mischievous spirit. Dorothy looked up as I spoke. "Is it all right, Jim?" she asked. "It's perfectly all right," I answered, and she fell back into her happy meditation, while I inwardly made still more remarks on her ingenious brother. Silent and happy we went on, my mind quite at rest now, and not in the least anxious to come to the end. The cab stopped, and the little door at the top opened with a click. "This is the place, sir." I jumped out and looked around. No cab in sight. "Well," I said to Dorothy, "here's a pretty go. Nobody in sight, and I don't know which is the house." Without a word, Dorothy leaned forward and whistled a single bar. Out of the fog came the notes repeated, and a moment later across the street came Tom. "Oh, you've reached her finally, have you?" said he, a trace sarcastically. "I thought you'd never arrive. I couldn't imagine what kept you." As he spoke, I heard a sort of choked gasp from the top of the hansom, but fortunately Dorothy's suspicions were not aroused. "It hasn't seemed so very long," she answered simply, to which Tom responded, "Oh, really, hasn't it?" as he took her arm to lead her across the street.
He called back to our cabby as we left. "Drive forward a little, and you'll find a sort of shelter where you can wait. The other cab's there." "Right, sir," came the reply, and we heard the slow movement of his disappearing wheels as we three were left in the ocean of fog. "Swenton's hunting up the caretaker," said Tom. "Hammerly and I have been waiting for him to come back. The old rooms are locked up tight." We found Hammerly in a vestibule where a single glass lamp flickered, and as we waited we fell into talking in low tones. The mist seemed to bring our voices to a minor key. Perhaps 10 minutes had passed when the door opened, and Swenton entered, accompanied by a man in a coarse ticking apron. "This is the caretaker, sir," he began, bowing to Dorothy and me. "He refused to let me in to get my things. Says the laboratory was left after Dr. Heidenmuller's death to another chemist, a gentleman who bought all the doctor's stuff from the heirs. He was there off and on for a little while, but he went away quite a long time ago. Went one night suddenly and never came back. This man says the agents won't allow anybody in. I brought him here so you could talk to him if you wished." The caretaker stood silent and sullen as Swenton spoke, his hands deep in the front pockets of his apron. "I do want to speak with him," said Tom briefly. "Come here," and he led the way apart, the caretaker following. A moment's conversation was broken only by a golden clink, accompanied by the jingle of keys, after which the caretaker disappeared and Tom turned back to us. "I have here," he said mysteriously, "a bunch of keys which I strangely found on the floor in the rear of this hall. Suppose we ascend to the top floor and see if they will work there." Dorothy's face was clouded as Tom came up to the spot where we were standing a little apart. Hammerly and Swenton had already started up the stairs. "I'm not sure that you are doing right in this, Tom," said Dorothy swiftly in a low voice. "I don't like to bribe a servant to let us into a place where we don't belong." Tom's face became serious in a minute. "I don't like it either, Dorothy," he answered gravely, "but I'm going to do it. Do you remember the little German middy lying down at the bottom? As long as the man who is trying to stop all war is at large, there are thousands of men in hourly peril. I honestly believe we are the only ones who can run the man down. I am convinced we shall be wholly justified in such action." Dorothy stood for a moment in silent thought. "I think you're right, Tom," she said quietly. "In this case, I hope and believe the end will justify the means. We must find the man. Go ahead." Stumbling through the darkness, we reached the top, where the flame of a match showed a strong oak door with 2 Yale locks upon it. Tom had the keys in immediately and threw the door open. Once within, Swenton passed with accustomed step to the wall, turned a switch, and incandescence lighted the whole place. We were in a sort of anteroom, with desks and chairs. "The outer office," said Swenton briefly. We passed to an inner door. "The main laboratory," remarked Swenton. This was similar to any other laboratory. A good-sized motor generator in one corner, covered by a rubber sheet, a couple of tile-topped tables, a set of shelves on one side filled with labeled reagent bottles, a set of glass cases supported on a base filled with drawers on the other. In the cabinets were glassware and apparatus of various sorts. Tom started for the case, but Dorothy laid a restraining hand on his arm. "Wait till we have seen it all. Then we'll go over the whole piece by piece." Tom nodded, and we went on. There were 3 doors on the opposite side of the wall. Swenton passed to the first and opened it. "The storeroom," he explained. Within were wooden cases of glassware, large carboys of acid, glass tubing on racks, and wire on spools. In one corner was apparently a hospital for broken or disused pieces of apparatus. We turned from this to the second door. "The balance room," said Swenton, as they threw open the portal. 3 balances in polished wood and shining glass met our eyes. There was nothing else in the room. Swenton opened a third door. "The spectroscope room," he said. "Beyond is the doctor's private laboratory." A big piece of apparatus on the table was covered with a green cloth. Beyond was a wooden door. Despite myself, I felt a queer, nervous tremor pass over my frame as I looked at the commonplace wooden panels, behind which Dr. Heidenmuller had sat, dead, killed by the same mysterious power which had slain the men I had seen lying quietly at the bottom of Portsmouth Harbour. Tom and Hammerly were as keen as hounds on a scent. Swenton interested, but more indifferent. Dorothy pale, her eyes glittering with excitement. Hammerly reached the door first,
tried it, and swung it back. The incandescent had not been turned on in the spectroscope room, and the only light which entered was the golden lane, which came through from the main laboratory. It seemed like a strange setting. The light fell on a heavy wooden table and a couple of Windsor chairs. The rest was but faintly outlined. A moment's pause on the threshold, as if we expected to meet some horror, we knew not what, and then we rushed in together. There was nothing to be seen. Wood-panelled walls, windows sealed by wooden shutters, the wooden table and the 2 wooden chairs. That was all. We stood there silent until Tom broke the quiet. "Nothing to do but to Sherlock Holmes it," he said. "We have all day to run this thing down. Swenton, there's a piece of apparatus here that I need. The doctor may never have had it outside his room as a whole, yet we may find traces of it in the laboratory or the storeroom. Are you willing to help us hunt?" "I should be the most ungrateful man living, sir, if I were not," said Swenton, earnestly. "I owe my wife's life to you and Miss Haldane." He glanced at Dorothy. "So that's where you've been the last 2 mornings," I whispered to her as Tom went on. "I found them just coming out of great distress," she answered simply. "I am so glad I was able to help." "Now," cried Tom, "let's sit down to another council of war. Come out into the outer laboratory and we'll talk it over." The drawn shades, the bright gleam of the laboratory lamps reflected back from polished tile and cabinet door, gave a distinctly cheerful aspect to the scene as we settled down. "I've been thinking this matter over carefully for some time," began Hammerly, in his rather careful tones, once we were seated, "and if you do not object, I should like to present my theories." "Go right ahead," said Tom. Hammerly went on somewhat thoughtfully. "I think you're wrong in saying we ought to follow the methods of Sherlock Holmes. We ought rather to follow Dupin, Poe's detective, the man who preceded Sherlock Holmes. Try to reason out what the doctor would have had on hand with regard to the power, and where he would have had it. Try to analyze the action of his brain, rather than hunt for minute data. Let's see what we know about Dr. Heidenmuller. He was a German of the most typical student type. That means he would never do anything without putting it down on paper. He had every desire to keep what he was doing from those around him. That is evident from the fact that Swenton never knew anything about the interior of this room. If the doctor made notes, as I believe he must have done, he would have wanted them within reach. So he must have had them in this room. He was a brilliant scientist, therefore he would not by preference have used any of the ordinary methods of concealment. His notes and apparatus were likely to take up a comparatively large amount of space, so that we are impelled to the definite conclusion that there is a concealed closet somewhere in that inner chamber. If we could take the time to remove the whole of the walls, and could get permission to do so, we could, I believe, find the hiding place. But that would involve time, expense, and running down the people who at present control the place and own the apparatus. I strongly question whether that would be worthwhile." "No," said Tom, "I don't believe it would. If there were any chance of the man who has hired this place being the man we are after, I'd say go for him at any cost. But I don't believe there's 1 chance in 1,000 that it is. He's too sharp to stay around where Dr. Heidenmuller died under such peculiar circumstances." "I agree to that," said Hammerly. "And I too," I chimed in. Dorothy said nothing, but as I watched her, I saw the rose of her cheeks growing deeper, and that peculiar change in her eye that showed she had already leapt beyond the reasoning of the others, and grasped the answer by intuition. "One question first," she began. "Mr. Swenton, did the doctor leave the door to the spectroscope room open when he went into his private room?" "No," answered Swenton slowly. "He would go into the spectroscope room, lock that door, and then you could hear the inner door open and shut. Sometimes he would not come out again, but I have often heard him come out into the anteroom about 3 or 4 minutes after he went in, stay there for a minute or 2, then go in again and come out once more. After that, he would be shut up there for hours together." "That settles it," cried Dorothy. "I'm sure I know how he opened his secret closet or closets. You remember the insulated wire covering they found when they came in after the doctor's death?" We all nodded eagerly. "That was the winding of an electromagnet. He attached it to the long flexible cord of that incandescent light socket in the anteroom, took it in, opened his closets, brought it out again, and went back. See if you can find an electromagnet in the cases or the storeroom, and we'll open things up."
Scarcely were the words out of her mouth before Swenton had hurried to a drawer and pulled out 3 small electromagnets, all of the same size. "Here are the only ones I know of in the laboratory," he exclaimed. "I can connect one of them with the flexible cord in a minute. We shall want more light, though. If one of you gentlemen will get another connector and fix it to a socket, I'll fit the magnet. You'll find some connectors for that size socket in the storeroom, I'm sure." With 4 practiced hands at work, it was scarce 10 minutes before an incandescent stood on the table in the inner room, while we had an electric magnet connected to a long flexible cord which brought current from an incandescent light socket in the next room. Dorothy stood in the center, once more in command. "I believe it's under one of those pegs," she said. "See what's under them." Round and round the room we went, pulling at every peg that joined the seal walls. Under each was a nail. Tom picked up one of the pegs as we drew it forth. "Humph!" he cried. "Insulated by Kima. That explains why the nails were left. What a careful job this was, anyway." Hammerly and Swenton nodded. I started to ask what Kima was, but I was pulling on a particularly refractory peg just then and let it go. The word stuck fast in my memory, however. It was the same one I had seen in Tom's book on our journey up from Portsmouth. As each peg came out, a little electromagnet was brought up to the hole and its action watched. Not a nail stirred. We had gone around 3 sides of the room when Tom called out, "This peg came easily. Bring over the magnet." Before I could bring the magnet within an inch of the hole, the nail within sprang out and attached itself to the magnet, just as a needle springs up and clings to the horseshoe magnet of a child. As it sprung, the whole panel, 4 feet high and 3 feet across, opened on easy hinges and swung outward, showing a small inner door. Tom gave a long, low whistle. "Right again, sister," he remarked. "What should we do without you?" The stout oak door, strong as it was, proved no obstacle to our attack, and readily swung outward. Stooping, we peered within. Empty shelves on one side, a row of drawers on the other. One by one we drew the drawers from their places. Every one was empty. From top to bottom the recesses we searched, but without avail. Finally we straightened up with blank faces. "There must have been something here," said Dorothy slowly. "Hang it!" ejaculated Tom. "I know there was. If you want to know my real opinion, there has been somebody here ahead of us. I don't believe we'll find a thing." We did not, and the last inspection over, we were ready to take our leave when Tom broke in. "One last thing," he said. "I want to see how that incandescent light in the ceiling can be connected without outside metal. That reflector, by the way, looks like clear glass, but it must have some reflecting power." He jumped lightly to a chair, thence to the table, and turned to look through the clear glass of the big hemispherical shade, which had guarded the incandescent in the ceiling. "Oh, I say," he exclaimed. "Here's a most extraordinary thing. Everything seen through this is bent double. Here's the biggest refraction I ever saw. Can it be the glass, or something inside of it? This thing is hermetically sealed above. Do you know, I believe we've got one solution of the mystery here?" We all stood looking eagerly up at him as he gazed through the globe. Chapter 13. With a quick spring, Dorothy was the first on a chair, and then on the table beside her brother. She bent to inspect the crystal hemisphere, looked at it from various points, and then both of them began examining the construction of the lampshade. "It's hermetically sealed above?" said Tom finally, a note of inquiry in his voice. "It seems to be," answered Dorothy briefly. "Tom, jump down, will you, and let Mr. Hammerly come up here. Jim, will you and Mr. Swenton see if you can find another lampshade like this in the storeroom?" We returned from our errand bearing a duplicate of the shade which we had found on a shelf. Dorothy, who by this time had come down from the table where Hammerly and Tom still stood, took the shade from my hands and held it to the light. "This shade is nothing but ordinary glass. There's nothing unusual about it," she exclaimed. "The effect of the shade up there must be due to a gas inside." As Tom and Hammerly leapt from the table to inspect the shade, I seized the opportunity to ascend, and mounting, gazed through the hemispherical glass. A strange world met my eyes. Everything seen through the glass was bent around at extraordinary angles. Tom's legs, seen below the shade, were perfectly natural and upright, but his torso, seen through the shade, was bent like the body of a Japanese contortionist, engaged in extremist posturing.
The straight line of the door casing beyond was broken short off where the line of the shade intersected it, and the top of the casing appeared in a wholly different place. As I gazed, I struggled to think what common everyday thing acted in much the same way. Eureka! I had it. Why, whatever is inside this globe bends everything seen through it. Something as a spoon is bent in a glass of water or an oar in a pond, I cried. Hammerly looked up. That's about right, Orrington. Or better yet, you could say it bends the things you see, as the hot gases rising from a chimney bend everything behind them into wavy lines. Haven't you ever watched the queer waviness that shows in a wintry atmosphere above chimneys when you look over them? Many a time, I replied. Well, it's just the same type of thing we have here. When you look across a chimney where hot gases from a fire are coming off, you are looking from air through lighter gases, for such hot gases are lighter than cold air, to cold air again. That extreme bending of light rays that we call refraction is the reason why we hope we have a new gas. If we can test the gas to find out what it is, it ought to be a big lift in finding out what really happened, I said, as I descended from the table. That won't be hard at all, interrupted Dorothy. We'll test it with the spectroscope in the next room. Here comes Tom now, with the apparatus to catch and confine the gas. With glass tubes and air pumps, with platinum and flame, they strove for half an hour, Tom, Hammerly, and Swenton together. Dorothy threw in a quiet word of suggestion now and then, but the most of the time she stood back with me. This was a matter for experts, and left nothing for me to do. As we waited, I asked Dorothy 2 questions. Where do you think the gas came from? Has it been here since Heidenmuller's death? I think it must have been, answered Dorothy. If, as I imagine, we have an unknown gas here, it is probably one of the products left behind from the metal destroyed by the terrific force used by the man. When the substance that gave the force, energy, or whatever you call it, escaped through the broken valve of the cigarette case, this gas was formed from the changed metal, and as it was lighter than the air, some of it rose and filled the shade. The rest floated upward and out through some crevice. When the man destroyed the Alaska or any of the other vessels, the same thing probably occurred. The metal of the ship changed to a gas, which floated up into the air with extreme rapidity. The gas must be to air as oil is to water. That is, it can't diffuse or mix with it any more than oil can mix with water. Otherwise it wouldn't have stayed all these months in that lampshade. Just then, Tom came towards us with a glass tube, a foot long and an inch or 2 wide, in his hand. In each end was sealed a bit of silvery metal. Platinum, I said, as I looked at them. Yes, said Tom, laughing. Mrs. Rosnowski taught you to know platinum when you see it. Just look through this. He held the tube before us, and the same magic bending of the lines showed as we gazed. The tube was filled with the gas that I had seen in the shade above. That's as pretty a piece of work as I ever did, said Tom approvingly. Transferred it without allowing practically a particle of air to get in. Now we're ready to try the current on it, and then the spectroscope. Rembrandt might well have painted the picture that I beheld, to hang beside the lesson in anatomy that dominates the old museum at The Hague. A striking group of 4, bent above the shining tubes and polished mountings of the spectroscope. Tom, eager with his fine lean face, showing the highest power of receptivity to new ideas, mouth mobile but firm, with an ever-present tendency towards an upward lift of the corners. Hammerly, careful, thoughtful scholar, in our college slang a little on the grind type, extremely bald, his glasses perched judicially on his rather prominent nose, his face showing the lines of deep and strong thought. Swenton, faithful and efficient follower, a man who would always be led, would never spring by any conceivable chance from the narrow channels where his lot had chained him. Dorothy, maxima et optima, now commanding by reason of her swift flying intellect, now yielding to her dreams as she had an hour or 2 ago in the hansom cab, and when yielding, most womanly, most thoroughly feminine of her sex. Faceted like a diamond, she shone upon the world through every facet, and every line, plane, and angle showed a new beauty, a new grace. The 4 stood eagerly intent upon the little tube before them, as they connected it with a huge coil which stood near. That done, everything was ready to throw the switch, which would send the electric current leaping from one platinum pole to another, penetrating the gas in the tube, heating it, changing its action, forcing it to submit to the current's tremendous force. "All ready?" asked Tom,
as he straightened up from the last adjustment. "Swinton, you turn off the lights, and I'll put on the current here." As the lights went out, we heard the sound of the throwing of the switch. Dorothy stepped back by me. A low buzz grew swiftly in intensity, and then a simultaneous cry broke from us all. Within the tube, a soft blue came slowly from out of the dark, the blue of early dawn on quiet waters. As we gazed, it turned darker, more brilliant. Now it was the deep steel blue of the biting autumn day, now the deep blue black of velvet tropic night. Every change, every hue was lighted by the rarest and most exquisite effulgence man could conceive. No glory bound to earth, it seemed, rather an unearthly brilliancy, perhaps such radiance as led the three kings, Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, to the manger where the young child lay. It awed us all. "That is beyond anything I ever saw," said Hammerly at length, breaking the silence. "I have observed every known gas under the influence of current, but never anything like this." "Nor I," said Tom, "but there may be no time to spare. Let's try it with the spectroscope." As Tom and Dorothy bent over the instrument, I asked Hammerly, "What do you expect to find from the spectroscope? What does it do?" "It breaks down light," answered Hammerly, "by means of a prism, as a prismatic chandelier or a prismatic glass thermometer throws the spectrum of sunbeam on the floor, breaking the white light of the sun into a shifting mass of color that changes from red through orange and green to violet. Every different glowing gas gives off a slightly different light. We can tell by the spectroscope whether the light from this gas is the same as any we have known before, or whether it is different. If the light waves sent out are unlike any recognized before, we can be sure we have a new gas." Tom was turning a screw, with his eye glued to a small telescope. "Change that tube a bit to the right, Hammerly," he said, and it was changed. "Now a bit higher. No, not so high. A bit lower now. There you are." He gazed long and intently, then rose, motioning Hammerly in silence to take his place. Dorothy followed Hammerly, and Swinton followed her. I ended, but I could distinguish nothing save some lines crossing a scale placed within the tube. As I rose from the stool, Tom reached up to throw on the lights. As he faced around, Hammerly met him with outstretched hand. "It is only given to a handful of scientists in a century," he said, "to find a new element, to discover one of those units from which the world is made. I believe you have done it this afternoon." "It is a new elementary gas," said Dorothy. "You found it, Tom, when you climbed the table." "Much good it will do me, so far as that goes," remarked Tom. "So far as we know, all there is of it in the world is in this tube. I don't know how to produce any more, and I can't publish anything about it, for it would interfere with our search for the man." "You have no right to say it's no use," said Dorothy. "Again and again, as we have gone on, the slightest unexpected things have come to mean the most. I believe this tube of unknown gas may be an important link in the chain." "All right," said Tom, "just as you say. You can be sure I wasn't going to throw it into the wastebasket." While Swinton cleared away, the rest of us went into the wooden room. Hammerly passed across and opened one of the wooden shutters. "The fog is lifting," he said. We looked out and saw that the other side of the street was gradually becoming visible. Dorothy seated herself by the window, and we joined her. "I don't know that there could be a better time," I began, "than right here and now, to find out just where we are. For my part, I want to understand the relation between the new gas and all that has gone before. If we bring all our information together, won't there be a better chance to get a line on our next move?" "We have two things in our hands," said Tom, thoughtfully. "This tube of gas here, and the cigarette case. We know that the ships really disappeared, because Jim has been to the bottom of Portsmouth Harbor and seen the men that lie there. We know by the same token that this force kills, by a sort of paralysis, every man whom it attacks. Oh, that reminds me," he exclaimed, checking himself. "Let me see that cigarette case again, if you will, Hammerly." The case once in his hand, he looked it over with minute care. "Insulated with the paraffin by Caema, don't you think?" he asked Dorothy. After a brief inspection, she also nodded. "That's Caema, all right." "Never mind Caema now, whatever it is," I said. "Let's go on with the business. What else do we know?" Hammerly took up the tale. We know to a reasonable certainty that Dr. Heidenmuller was the first man who found the source of this power, and that he died when it accidentally was let loose. We know that some of this substance, probably in powder form like radium, was kept in the leather cigarette case, insulated by paraffin and chyma." He paused. "We know," went on Dorothy, "that when the man who is trying to stop all war uses this force, a tremendous amount of radioactivity energy is generated, enough to affect reflectoscopes half around the world." "We know there is something which is even more than all those," I broke in. "We know there is a man who is slaughtering men by the hundreds in pursuit of his ideal, and that it is our business in more ways than one to run him down. How will the data we have on hand enable us to do that?" As I spoke, Dorothy was sitting looking meditatively out of the window. The fog had lifted a little more. Amerly straightened in his chair. "Miss Haldane," he said, "if you will look straight across the street from where you are sitting, you can see the spot from which the sign fell on the day that Dr. Heidenmuller died." Dorothy turned in her chair, and we all crowded about her. Amerly pointed across the road. There, against the brick wall of an old house, blackened by the smoke of many sooty years, two small rectangles showed in light relief against the surrounding darkness. The sight of those spots, where the supports to the sign had once stood, brought the whole horror of it home to me more forcibly than anything else. The very smallness, the homeliness of the thing drove it in. The accumulated effects of the charged electroscopes, of the wave measuring machine, of the bodies on the ocean's floor, of Dr. Heidenmuller's death, and of the gas we had just found, rose to their very crest in those small light gray spots, less sullied than the rest of the wall. "And there is where the wooden sign fell down, and its iron supports disappeared," said Tom reflectively. "Jove, I'd like to have seen it happen. If anybody had seen it, though, he wouldn't have believed his eyes." We were still standing, peering out through the rising mist, when Dorothy spoke out excitedly. "That's the next clue. There's nothing else that would do so well. The hunt for disappearing iron." "What good will that do?" said Tom. "We know where iron has disappeared, and we've run everything down as far as we could. It isn't like that Heidenmuller or the man went around shooting off signs for fun." "Of course not," answered Dorothy impatiently. "But don't you see the man must have had a laboratory or lodgings anyway, somewhere in London, if he got his data and his power from Dr. Heidenmuller here. When Dr. Heidenmuller let his discovery get away from him, it killed him, and caused all the metal which it reached to disappear. Now the man hasn't been killed by his weapon, unless it happened very recently, but it's perfectly possible that he might have allowed some of his magic substance to escape without injury to himself. If that happened, it would destroy any metal at hand. If we could find some place where iron disappeared, we might get a direct clue to the whereabouts of the man. It's worth trying anyway." "I'm sure it is," I cried. "Tom, you old doubter, speak up and admit Dorothy knows twice as much about it as you and I put together." "I guess not," said Tom firmly. "There may be something in it, if we could get track of everything that bore on disappearing iron, London over. But," he went on, "talk about a needle in a haystack. You went up against a hard enough proposition in running down Heidenmuller's laboratory here, but this new deal is far worse. You can't advertise." "No, I don't see how you can," remarked Dorothy, a trifle discouraged. "Oh, this thing's easy enough," I broke in. "I wish everything was as simple. Inside of 2 days I'll have all the information that London holds with regard to disappearing iron." "How can you get it?" cried the three in unison. Chapter 14. "By using the device which ministers at the same time to the vanity and the necessity of man, the clipping barrel," I replied. "We will subscribe to that distributor of special information and get every clipping for the last 6 months that bears upon falling blinds, signs lost, or stolen iron. They can ransack the files for us and send us the result of their labor." "Just the trick," cried Tom enthusiastically. "We'll go straight to work on it. Now, let's get out of here." Bearing our precious tube of gas, we started back, leaving Swenton to close the laboratory and follow later. No such delightful wandering was provided for our return as for our coming. All too soon we were back at the Savoy, with our day's labor over, ready to follow the new trail wherever it might lead us. 2 mornings after the eventful day in Heidenmuller's laboratory, I knocked at Dorothy's door, and entered to find the broad table of her sunny parlour covered with piles of neat clippings, each with a docketed slip at the top. The clipping bureau had exceeded my best hopes, and had turned in the information in quantities. Tom and Dorothy were bending over the piles, sorting them, as the maid ushered me in. "If you hadn't told them to sort these things at their office, we should have been swamped beyond all hope of salvation," grumbled Tom, as he stood with a bundle of clippings between every finger of both hands. "Where are the Westminster shutters, Dorothy?" "Here they are," said Dorothy. "Now I want the Chelsea signs. It's just like solitaire. The signs are my cards. Blinds go to Tom, and you can take stolen iron. That's stolen iron, that heap of packets over there on the other side of the table." I sat down to my task. Hour after hour passed, and we sorted, read, and rejected. Now and then a clipping would go aside for further reference. Occasionally a packet or a single slip would pass from one to another. Lunch took an hour, but after lunch we turned again to our labors, and afternoon tea time came and went before we were done. At length Tom rose and gave a mighty yawn. "8 that look good," he remarked. "8 from me," I echoed. "10," chimed in Dorothy. "That's not half bad," said Tom reflectively. "There were hundreds of clippings there, and we've brought them down pretty low, all things considered." We three dined alone that night, and when the coffee came on, Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a long envelope with the 26 clippings. "Which comes first?" he asked. "Signs or blinds or stolen iron?" "Match you to decide," I answered, and pulled out a sovereign. "I'll take signs, you take shutters." Tom won. "Shutters against stolen iron, then," Dorothy cried. "I'll match you this time," said Tom. We matched again, and again Tom won. "Then one of my 8 shutters is the trump card," exclaimed Tom. "I'll number them 1 to 8 and then pass the bunch around so we can each pick the 2 that look like winners. Then I'll pass the signs to pick a second choice." Dorothy, in her gray gown of shimmering silk, her face flushed with the excitement of the decision, pored over the little list carefully for some minutes before she returned them to Tom, who passed them on to me, remarking briefly, "I made up my mind when I picked the 8 out of the bunch." 3 times over I read the list, which told of blinds dropping on still days and injuring passers-by. Tom had eliminated the accounts which told of signs and shutters blown off in gales. It might easily happen that a gale and the escape of the destructive power would occur simultaneously, but the unusual was the thing we were after. There, most of all, would lie the clue we sought. At last I came to a decision and looked up. 1 in the first lot and 3 in the second," I said. 1 in 3, echoed Dorothy. "The same," said Tom. "Great thing to be unanimous. Read 'em aloud, Jim." I obeyed. "A shutter which fell from a house on Gower Street, just off Tottenham Court Road. Struck a passing labourer yesterday morning, and inflicted injuries of so grave a character that he was immediately removed in an unconscious condition to the hospital. His identity has not yet been established." That's number 1. "A large sign which fell from a second story at Chelsea yesterday broke in pieces on the sidewalk beneath, but fortunately inflicted no serious injury." That's number 3. "Which do we choose?" "Both of those look rather good to me," answered Tom, "but I think the one near Tottenham Court Road looks best. The chances of finding the man's laboratory would be greater in Bloomsbury than further out." Dorothy nodded her approval. "All right," I said, as we rose. "The Corps will move upon Bloomsbury at dawn, under command of General Dorothy Haldane." "Dawn being interpreted as 9:30, we will," answered Dorothy, laughing. The next morning found us bowling along towards our destination, discussing meanwhile the method of attack. "Leave it to inspiration," I said, as we drew up at the door. "Let me play a lone hand on this." Luck was with me. There was a sign of lodgings in the window. Leaping out, I walked up the steps and rang the bell, while the cab went on down the street. The maid who opened the door was trimmer than I had expected to find. The mistress of the lodging-house, when she appeared, though a perfect mountain of flesh, gave signs of a very considerable intelligence. Yes, there were lodgings, a 2nd and 4th floor front. Up the stairs panted and wheezed the stout landlady, while I followed in her train. On the 4th floor we halted and entered the small hall bedroom at the top of the stairs. I threw the window open and leaned out and looked up and down the street. "Bad thing if a shutter fell from here," I said. "Wasn't it in one of the houses near this that a shutter fell and injured a labourer a couple of months ago?" The landlady seized my lead instantly. "It was the right-hand shutter," she said, "in the very window you're looking out of now." I bent eagerly to look at the hinges. They were brand new. while those on the other side were strained and worn through years of exposure to wind and sun and rain. "You don't say," I replied. "Most interesting. I suppose the hinges rusted and broke?" "No," said the landlady. "That was one of the queerest things about it. After the whole thing was over, I came to look at the place where the shutter fell. There was no trace of a hinge. It must have pulled right out of the brick, and when I went the next day to look at the shutters in the kitchen, the hinges, screws, and everything were gone, and I never saw the least trace of them from that day to this. We had the new shutter put up a week later." What luck, I thought to myself, as I looked around over the adjoining housetops. Hit it first time trying. Somewhere behind those roofs lies the laboratory of the man who is trying to stop all war. I parted with the landlady, promising an early decision, and went in search of Tom and Dorothy. They left the carriage as I approached and hurried towards me. "The iron of the shutter disappeared," I said significantly. Tom gave the long low whistle which always typified interest and surprise to him. "You think the man's laboratory is somewhere near here, then?" asked Dorothy excitedly. "Judging by Hammerly's experience with the sign opposite Dr. Heidenmuller's laboratory, I certainly do," I answered seriously. "This probably happened just as that did." "Then," said Tom, "it's probably up to us to make a house-to-house canvass of the neighborhood. It looks to me as if the chances were better in one of the buildings on Tottenham Court Road than in any of the houses round here." "That's right," I answered briefly. "Tell you what we'll do. We'll ask at every shop if they know of any chemical laboratory. Tell them we're hunting for a man who works in such a laboratory. Lay it on thick and give them plenty of detail. That's the way to get the information you want." "I'll wait for you in the carriage round the corner," Dorothy called after us as we started away. From bake shop to dairy, from furniture store to shoe shop, I travelled, searching for some news of my poor cousin George, who had worked in a laboratory somewhere near the corner of Tottenham Court Road and Gower Street, and who had disappeared. Persistently diplomatic, I forced my way on, under rebuff after rebuff, leaving no store until I had a pretty vivid idea of the various occupations which made their home on every floor of its building. As I left, after receiving one particularly stinging answer, I caught sight of Tom across the street, beckoning. I followed him at a little distance until he turned a sharp corner into a little alley. He appeared slightly dishevelled as he turned around. "See here," he said abruptly. "I'm afraid we'll be run in if we keep this up much longer. I've been in one row already. Had to knock a man down who made caustic remarks about sneak thieves. What have you got hold of, anyway?" "I haven't got hold of a thing," I responded. "Well, then," said Tom, "let's cast back and take another look at the topography, just where the shutter fell." Back we went over the ground once more, and stopped to examine cautiously the window with its green blind. "That's a 4th-story corner room," said Tom reflectively, "and the house next to it is only 3 stories. Why, you blind man," he went on suddenly, "only one side of the shutter fell, so the attack couldn't have come from the front. It must have come from the back of the house. Let's go round and see what is just behind this." Round the square we circumnavigated, landing finally at a building some 5 stories high, whose first story showed the shelves and cluttered window of a second-hand bookshop. Beside the shop a flight of stairs led to the upper stories. No sign gave evidence of any business carried on above the first. "Here goes for the bookshop," said Tom, and we marched in. A tall, stooping youth of exaggerated height, with lank and flaming red mustache, came wearily forward, stifling a cavernous yawn as he came. We repeated our stock inquiry to him. We were colonials from Australia, seeking our cousin George, who worked in a laboratory. Did our friend with the red mustache know of any laboratory near? A gleam of interest lighted the slightly watery eyes. "I don't know rightly whether it's a laboratory or not," he began, "but there's some sort of a bloomin' show occupies our whole 5th. I've never been able to see inside of it yet. You might try a shot at it over." We received a volley of misplaced aspirates with joyous hearts, noting the gleam of avid curiosity in the watery eyes, as the clerk thought of the mysterious laboratory on the top floor. All he could tell was that the top floor had been let a few months before to a tall man. With the usual vagueness of his type of mind, that was as far as he could go. Over and over again he repeated the same indefinite phrase, "a tall man." When the man moved in, a couple of vans had brought strange furnishings, a small furnace, glassware, and instrument cases. A little while ago an assistant had appeared, a foreigner who knew no English, or at least refused to understand the language. The two, the man and his assistant, often worked together till late at night. Sometimes the clerk believed they worked all night. As for him, he would have repeated the thing to the police. He didn't believe in having mysteries like that around. But his master, the proprietor of the bookshop, refused to part with regular paying tenants. Yes, sir, he'd try again and again to see what they were doing, but there was a curtain over the door, and you couldn't see anything through the keyhole. The door was always locked, so that the adventurous spirit of the clerk had to be content with imagining the horrible crimes perpetrated behind the curtained door. This certainly looked good. With anxious hearts, Tom and I started up the stairs in search once more of our cousin George, halting, however, at the second story once the clerk was left safely behind. "It certainly looks like Queer Street anyway," remarked Tom reflectively. "It may be the man, or it may be some bunch of counterfeiters or other criminals. I'm not going to back down for a minute, but I think one of us had better hunt up Dorothy, tell her where we are, and have her put the police on the trail if we shouldn't happen to turn up tonight. Strikes me that would be only an elementary precaution." "I'll do it," I said. "You watch here." Before Tom could object, I was halfway down the stairs and out on the street. On Tottenham Court Road, I found Dorothy driving up and down. She leaned forward questioningly as I jumped in. I nodded in answer. "Yes, we got the place, but we need your help now." Warned by experience as to its necessity, I had mapped out my line of argument carefully as I hurried along. "We have the very place, but we want you to stay outside and send us help if we should get into trouble." Dorothy's face fell. "I want to go with you in the worst way. Yet I don't like the idea of you two going into danger without any outside assistance. What have you found out?" It was no easy matter to convince her, yet when Dorothy saw the condition of affairs, there was really nothing she could do but give in. For us to explore that unknown territory without some line on the outside to protect us in case of peril was manifestly unwise. Certainly it was not possible for us to let so plain a clue go by. At my command, the cabman drove past the old bookstore, up the street, and round the square. Back on the main thoroughfare again, I made ready to return and join Tom. "You've got the place fixed clearly in mind?" I asked, looking up at her from the sidewalk. To my surprise, Dorothy's eyes were filled with tears, and her voice came pleadingly. "I wish you did not feel you had to go. I don't know why I feel so strangely about your going, but I do. Isn't there some other way out?" I felt my resolution waning, as an almost overmastering desire to seize her in my arms, in the face of shocked and respectable Bloomsbury, swept over me. "We've got to follow the trail to the inn, Dorothy," I answered. "Everything's going to be all right. Don't worry." As I turned away, I felt a light touch, almost like a caress, on my coat sleeve. Accident or not, no knight ever went into battle more inspired by his lady's gage than I. Bearing that accolade, strode towards the old bookshop and the mysterious laboratory on the 5th floor. Tom greeted me eagerly as I reached the second story. "Not a sound from the laboratory," he began. "And luck of lucks, there's an open, empty room opposite where we can wait. Come on up." Up the stairs and into the empty room we passed, pausing briefly to examine the blank and heavy door of the mysterious workers fastened by heavy locks. Our waiting place proved nothing more than a bare attic chamber, with a constricted view of roofs and chimney pots. "Not exactly the abode of luxury," I said, glancing around critically. "But then it's all in a day's work. I've waited in worse places for a lot smaller stakes." Folding his greatcoat for a cushion, Tom seated himself back against the wall. He had left the door a trace ajar. "I'm practically sure that there's no one in there now, and we'll wait here till they arrive. But shall we be sure to hear them when they come up the stairs? By Jove, never thought of it. Not a thing to read with us. There's a bookshop downstairs. I wonder if I dare to try a sortie." He thought for a moment. "No, not yet, anyway. Tell you what I'll do. Here's a sporting proposition for you." He pulled out his penknife and opened it. "Here's a bully bare floor. I'll play you a game of stick knife to while away the time." Nobody but an eternal boy like Tom would have conceived of a game of stick knife to while away the time of waiting before the mystery hidden by the blank face of the oaken door across the passage. Nobody but an eternal boy would have won so exasperatingly. Expert in all intricacies of the art, Tom had far outdistanced me as a knife juggler, and I was lagging far in the rear, when we heard the quiet closing of the door 5 stories below. In an instant we were on our feet, waiting for the ascending heavy footsteps. Tom's mobile face stiffened into rigid lines as he crouched, poised beside the door, while I stood ready to swing the door open and spring, if necessary, on the man who came. As the footsteps halted on the landing before us, Tom bent towards me. "The assistant," he whispered. "Let him unlock the door and we'll push our way in with him." Everything happened in the twinkling of an eye. The jingle of keys, the slight creak of the opening door, then a sudden bound, and we were across the hall and in an anteroom, facing a bewildered man, evidently a Norwegian, whose blond face was framed in flaxen hair and spade-shaped flaxen beard, and whose somewhat cow-like eyes peered out from spectacles of massive frame. He was clothed in a queer, straight-fronted, long blue sack-coat with voluminous, almost sailor-like trousers. As he saw us standing on either side of him, he started back for a moment, but then stopped short, his keys still dangling from his hand. "Pardon this somewhat sudden entrance," I said in my politest tone, "but we are inspectors to visit the laboratory." A flood of unintelligible gutturals followed my statement. This was accompanied by vehement pointings at the door by which we had entered, and which was now closed, with Tom before it. I sat on the table swinging my legs till the torrent passed. Then, as it died away, I walked boldly to one of the two doors on the opposite side to that which we entered, tried it, and then tried the other. Both were locked. Carefully watching the assistant's face, I pointed first at the keys still dangling forgotten in his hand, and then pointed at the first door I had tried, going to it and shaking the lock. To our surprise, the indignation in the man's countenance suddenly ceased. A mild acquiescence shone from behind his glasses, and going forward he unlocked the door, opened to a twilight behind, and went in. We stumbled in to the half-light, Tom closing the door behind us. As we entered, I tripped over a chair and fell headlong, throwing Tom, who was following. As I scrambled to my feet, a guttural laugh rang in my ears and a door slammed. There was a sound of bolts run home as I dashed forward, only to come headlong against a closed door. I rushed back to the door through which we had entered and shook it in vain, hearing to my bitter mortification a bolt running into its slide as I shook. A sound followed by another outburst of northern Teutonic glee. Foiled on both sides, I wheeled to look about me and saw Tom already making a rapid investigation of the premises. We were in a small room, perhaps 10 by 12, surrounded by blank walls save for openings made by the two doors on opposite sides. The only passage to the outer air was through an iron plate, perhaps 9 inches by 3 feet, placed in the flat roof. In this were set small glass bullseyes of the same type as those used to light basements from sidewalks. A couple of wooden stools made the only furnishings of the room. Tom turned to me at the end of his inspection and shook his head. "I've made many a bad break in my life," he said regretfully, "but coming in here after you and closing that door is the worst yet. That assistant with his fool face tricked me completely." "Same here," I answered, "but there's no use in wasting time talking about it. If there's any possible way to do it, we must be out of here before the man can notify the master." "Right," said Tom. "Let's try smashing our way out first by aid of these stools." In the pause that followed this proposal, we heard the heavy, slow step of the assistant cross the anteroom, heard the opening and the closing of the outer door. We were left alone. "Good," said Tom. "Now we can make all the noise we want to." Suiting the action to the word, he gave a mighty blow to the door with the wooden stool. The door stood like a rock, but the stool flew to pieces, the fragments of its seat narrowly missing me as they flew by. "A well-made door," said Tom reflectively. "They don't have doors like that in most modern houses." As he spoke, he crossed the room to examine the door on the opposite side. "Same staunch build," he remarked judicially. "We couldn't be caged better outside a prison. I'm rather lighter than you, Jim," he went on. "Let me get up on your shoulders and try this small roof window." He climbed up and in a minute or two came down again. "Padlocked with an iron bar and staple from the outside," he said briefly. "There's just one thing left, to dig our way out with our knives through that solid oak door. I don't know, of course, whether we can do it or not, but I think it's the only alternative." "That's one way, but not the only one," I said. "One thing we can do first, put a signal out for Dorothy." "How can you signal Dorothy?" asked Tom. break a hole in one of those glass bullseyes up there," I answered, "and put a rung of the broken stool up through, with my handkerchief tied on it." "Good work," said Tom. "Just the ticket." In 2 minutes our flag of distress was waving on the roof. "Now for the door," I cried, and we both set to work on the hard oak about the lock. British oak is proverbially tough, but that oak was the toughest that ever came out of Britain's primeval forests, I verily believe. When we had worked on it for what seemed like an endless time, we had but a slight furrow on either side of the lock, and 2 broken blades to show for our labors. Still, we kept doggedly on, chiseling and cutting little by little, till some impression really began to be made. At length Tom straightened up painfully. "That's back-breaking work, all right," he remarked with a groan. "I never knew how much I sympathized with escaping prisoners till now." As we leaned against the wall, I heard a slight movement outside. "Hush," I muttered. "There's a sound." The noise grew louder. It was a key turning in the inside door. Then not one but 3 or 4 persons came hurriedly across the floor towards the door by which we had entered. Tom seized the whole stool and poised it ready to rush out, while I gripped a rung of the broken one. The bolt shot back, the key turned, the door swung open, and there in the rectangle stood Dorothy, Hammerly, the assistant who had imprisoned us, and an unknown elderly man. In a moment Dorothy was in Tom's arms, but her hand groped for mine as she clung to him. She sobbed only for a moment, recovering herself almost as swiftly as she had broken down. "Good work, old girl," said Tom, patting her. "I don't think frankly that I was ever so glad to see you in all my life." As Dorothy, still with a slightly tremulous smile, turned towards me, Tom gave his hand to Hammerly. "How in blazes did Dorothy do this trick anyway?" he asked. "I saw your signal of distress from the other side of the street," broke in Dorothy, "and I drove straight to the museum for one of our friends there. I didn't want to bother with police if I could help it. I met Mr. Hammerly just where you met him before, on the steps. And just think, this good man here is the bookshop man. We met him as we came down to the door after trying the place." "So you and Hammerly charged the lion's den alone, did you?" I interrupted. "Why, of course," said Dorothy. "It's all due to her," said Hammerly. "No, it's due to the assistants getting frightened," said Dorothy. "Isn't it, Mr. Elder?" "If you'd not been here, Miss Haldane," said the bookstore proprietor, "I never should have known what he was after. I couldn't make out at all." "What kind of laboratory is this?" I asked, determined not to be thrown off the scent. The old man laughed. "I fancy my clerk must have been telling you some queer things. I've never told him all I knew. I don't mind keeping him wondering. This is my brother's laboratory, and as to what he does, look here." He threw open the second door, and we gazed in. Sets on sets of false teeth, boxes of dentist's supplies, and dental machinery met our view. I suddenly began to laugh. Tom looked at me for a moment and burst into peal on peal of laughter, while the whole crowd, even the assistant who had been gazing anxiously at us meanwhile, finally joined in. At last, weak with laughter, I asked, "Why did the assistant shut us up?" "He thought you were burglars," explained the bookshop man, "and as my brother is out of town, he ran for me. My brother is a little careful whom he lets in, as he does his main business in another place, and this is a side affair." And so the incident of the false teeth laboratory closed. The outer air had never seemed so good to me save twice before, when I left the New York prison in Tom's motor car, headed for Dorothy, and when I came out from the bottom of Portsmouth Harbor. I took in long breaths of it as we walked towards the carriage, and as we drove towards the hotel. Dorothy sat silent beside Tom, but every now and then I met her eyes, and they fell. The old look seemed gone. There was a change, a new and very sweet timidity. Tom drew a long breath. "A good night's sleep," he said, "and we'll tackle clipping number 3. "Agreed," said I. "Agreed," chimed in Dorothy, "provided you'll take me with you, but I won't go through another afternoon like this for anybody."